You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
On January 20th, 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy took the oath of office as the 35th President of the United States. Only 43 years of age, Kennedy became the youngest man ever to be elected to the presidency. His youthful enthusiasm and inspiring rhetoric stirred in the nation a new spirit of hope and expectation.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
What began with such promise, however, would end less than 3 years later in tragedy. On November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, shot to death while riding in an open limousine through the city streets of Dallas, Texas. The death of such a young and vigorous leader was an overwhelming event which stunned both the nation and the world. In the years that followed, though, the Kennedy assassination became much more than a national tragedy. When viewed in light of later assassinations, the war in Vietnam and the discontent at home, the Watergate scandal, with its resignations of both a vice president and then a president, the death of John Kennedy emerges as a major turning point in American history, symbolizing for many Americans the beginning of a growing public distrust in our government's leaders and institutions. Yet if the effects of the assassination become clearer with each year, the facts surrounding the shooting itself remain obscured in controversy and confusion. And while most people no longer believe the government's official conclusion that John Kennedy was killed by a single assassin, few fully understand the factual basis behind their dissent. In the next 50 minutes, then, we will turn our attention to an analysis of those facts and re-examine what has become one of the most important and complex mysteries in history. It was politics that motivated Kennedy to make the trip to Texas. There, he had hoped to reconcile differences between two factions of the state's Democratic Party, as well as drum up political support in a state that he had barely carried back in 1960. Kennedy, in fact, had felt the visit to be so crucial to his re-election chances that he persuaded his wife, Jacqueline, to accompany him. The first day of the trip, which included visits to Houston and San Antonio on November 21st, had been very successful. Despite his mediocre rating in the latest Gallup poll, overwhelming and enthusiastic crowds greeted the President and the First Lady at every stop along the tour. Late in the morning of Friday, November 22nd, the presidential party arrived at Dallas's Love Field, where the president was again met by a large and exuberant crowd. After taking time out to shake hands, the Kennedys, along with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie, stepped into a waiting limousine which would take them through the downtown district on the way to the city's Trade Mart, where the president was to give a luncheon speech. As the motorcade made its way through the streets of Dallas, it was obvious that Kennedy's trip was a tremendous success. Near the end of the motorcade route, the limousine entered Dealey Plaza, a small open area on the outskirts of the city. After turning right onto Houston Street, the president's car traveled one short block and then turned very sharply left onto Elm Street, where it passed beneath the Texas School Book Depository. It was 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. At this point, Abraham Zapruder, a Dallas clothing manufacturer who watched the motorcade from atop a grassy slope to the west of the book depository, turned on his 8mm Bell & Howell movie camera. Focusing his telephoto lens on the president, Zapruder captured the most shocking and sensational piece of film in history. Immediately after the shooting, the limousine raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors worked desperately to save the president's life and to care for Governor Conley, who was also seriously injured in the shooting. Although the governor would make a full recovery, it was obvious to the doctors that Kennedy's wounds were fatal, and at approximately 1 p.m., the president was pronounced dead. Shortly before 1:15 p.m., 45 minutes after the assassination, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit was shot to death outside his squad car in the Dallas suburb of Oak Cliff. 1/2 hour later, police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald, an employee at the Texas School Book Depository, in a movie theater near the site of the Tippit shooting. Originally only suspected in the murder of the police officer, Oswald soon became the prime suspect in the assassination as well. Later that night, Oswald was formally charged with the murder of John F. Kennedy. Throughout the next 2 days, despite repeated public accusations of his guilt by the Dallas police, Oswald continually denied the charges.
All right, these people have given me a hearing without legal representation or anything. Did you shoot the president? I didn't shoot anybody, no, sir.
The alleged assassin, however, would not have a chance to prove his innocence. On Sunday, November 24th, in perhaps the most bizarre scene ever witnessed on live television, Oswald was himself shot and killed by Jack Ruby, the owner of a Dallas striptease club, as police attempted to transfer Oswald from the city to the county jail. The death of the only suspect in the assassination precluded a trial that might have turned up all the facts about the president's murder. President Lyndon Johnson, therefore, appointed a commission to investigate and report upon the facts relating to the assassination. This panel, headed by then Chief Justice Earl Warren, conducted a 6-month investigation into the death of President Kennedy. In late September 1964, the Warren Commission submitted an 888-page report to President Johnson. Their findings, universally known as the Warren Report, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in killing President Kennedy and that there was no evidence of a conspiracy involving either Oswald or Jack Ruby. Immediately upon its release, the Warren Report was met with wide critical acclaim from the news media. The commission was praised for its diligence and its definitive account of the assassination. Within a few years, however, the report would be seriously attacked by a broad range of independent researchers who questioned the commission's findings, evidence, and procedures. The doubts raised by these critics have remained. According to recent surveys, as little as 13% of the American public still believes that Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole assassin of President Kennedy. At the center of these doubts lies the commission's reconstruction of the crime, a reconstruction that, as we shall see, relied not upon fact, but upon a most improbable theory. In reconstructing the assassination, the Warren Commission concluded that a total of 3 shots were fired at the presidential limousine as it moved down Elm Street. All of the shots coming from this 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Citing the results of the autopsy performed on the president's body, the report stated that President Kennedy was struck by 2 of these bullets. The first bullet entered at the back of his neck and exited in the lower portion of his throat, causing a wound which would not necessarily have been lethal. A second shot then struck the president in the back of the head, causing a massive and fatal wound. Based upon the medical reports and the testimony of the doctors from Parkland Hospital, the commission concluded that Governor Connally was hit by 1 bullet. This bullet entered the right side of the governor's back and traveled downward through his chest, breaking his 5th rib. The bullet then passed through his right wrist, breaking the radius bone before finally entering his left thigh, where it caused a superficial wound. In its most controversial conclusion, the report then stated, although it is not necessary to any essential findings of the commission to determine just which shot hit Governor Connally, there is very persuasive evidence from the experts to indicate that the same bullet which pierced the president's throat also caused Governor Connally's wounds. This assertion that 1 bullet hit both President Kennedy and Governor Connally became known as the single bullet theory. It would become the most challenged aspect of the entire Warren report. While the commission claimed that it was not necessary to determine just which shot hit Governor Connally, the critics argued that it was crucial. Dr. Cyril Wecht is one of the country's leading forensic pathologists and an outspoken critic of the Warren Commission report.
It is the crux of the Warren Commission report. It is the keystone of their conclusions that Lee Harvey Oswald was a sole assassin. Without the single bullet theory, from a physical evidence standpoint, there cannot be a conclusion that Oswald, or for that matter, any other single human being in all the world, executed the assassination of Kennedy and the wounding of Connally.
The single bullet theory was essential to the commission's case because of a timing conflict between the wounding of the 2 men, as seen on the Zapruder film, and the time needed to operate the bolt-action rifle which the commission said Oswald had used. FBI and Secret Service tests at the assassination site, together with a framation of the Zapruder film, revealed that President Kennedy and Governor Connally were wounded within 1.6 seconds of each other. Tests with the rifle found in the book depository, however, showed that even in the hands of an expert, the weapon required a minimum of 2.3 seconds to fire 2 shots. Since it was therefore physically impossible for the alleged murder weapon to have been fired twice during the time period in which both the president and the governor were wounded, only 2 possibilities existed. Either both men were hit by the same bullet, or there was a second assassin. The single bullet theory was further necessitated by the commission's conclusion that only 3 shots were fired. One of these shots, though, by frame examining, was known to have missed the limousine entirely, striking a curbstone near the triple underpass. While it was not known which of the 3 shots missed, the commission was forced to acknowledge that one did because a nearby witness, James Tagg, was cut on the cheek by the ricocheting cement. A second shot struck only the president, causing his fatal head injury. This then leaves only 1 shot left to account for all of the other wounds on the 2 men. If a 4th shot was fired, it could only have been by a second gunman, as even the commission conceded that there was not enough time for Oswald to have fired 4 shots. While an analysis of the single bullet theory cannot tell us who fired the shots or what role Oswald might have played in the shooting, it does hold the answer to whether or not President Kennedy was killed by a lone assassin. Simply stated, if President Kennedy and Governor Connally were not hit by the same bullet, then there must have been at least 1 other gunman. Critics of the commission raised many objections to the single bullet theory, the first and the most obvious one being that the Zapruder film shows the 2 men being struck at different times and therefore by separate shots. Robert Groden is a photo optics expert who has spent many years examining the Zapruder film.
Unfortunately, there's a road sign between the lens of the camera and the president at about the time of the first shot, which obliterates the view. So we can't tell exactly when the president was first hit. We do know that by the time his head disappears behind the road sign, it does not appear that he has been hit yet. At frame 225, President Kennedy shows the first signs of being hit. That is, he reemerges from behind the road sign and his hands are coming up toward his throat, being clenched. Governor Connally, on the other hand, doesn't show signs of being hit until frame 237 to 238. We have quite a stretch of time there.
To me, it's rather obvious that the president had been struck before Governor Connally was wounded, because the president was placing his hand up to his throat. And at that time, the governor was showing no signs of any distress that he had been struck in any way. It was just a few frames later that he obviously had been wounded and showed signs that he was in pain.
Now, he shows at this particular point in time a reaction as his shoulder buckles, his cheeks puff out, his hair becomes disheveled, all at frame 238.
Till frame 236, or 11 frames after the president appears hit, that Governor Connally shows the first signs of reacting to his wounds. In this and subsequent frame, students of the Zapruder film agree that it is not intentional. Connally's shoulder is driven sharply down, and his cheeks puff out as they are filled with air from his collapsing right lung. Equally important in determining when the governor was hit, though, is an earlier frame, one in which he is not showing a reaction.
Frame 230 is an extremely important frame, has always been a key element in my own deductions and analysis. That frame shows Governor Connally, who is sitting directly in front of President Kennedy, still clutching a large white Texas Stetson hat in his right hand, clutched between his thumb and forefinger. The nerve that permits that kind of apposition is the ulnar nerve. That nerve had been severed in Governor Connally by the bullet that pierced his right wrist.
And yet, if Governor Connally has been hit by frame 230, as the single bullet theory demands, he must continue to hold his hat for almost a second and a half after he has been shot through the wrist. So convincing is the film of the two separate shots that both the FBI and the Secret Service reports on the assassination stated that the two men were hit by different bullets. Harold Weisberg is a former Senate investigator who has written 6 books on the assassination.
Neither the FBI nor the Secret Service supported the single bullet theory, and as of the last time I saw any of their records that include a reference to it, they were still not sort of laughing about the commission and its single bullet theory. They both agreed in their theories that the first shot hit President Kennedy and nobody else, that the second shot hit Governor Connally and nobody else, and that the third shot hit President Kennedy and nobody else. However, both the Secret Service and the FBI knew very well that a bullet had struck a curbstone, and a spray of concrete had wounded Jim Tegg. It was on the police radio. The FBI transcribed the police radio tapes. It was on the front page of the Dallas papers the next day. Everybody knew. But they just ignored it because they were determined to insist that there was a single assassin and that it was Lee Oswald.
The commission, however, could not ignore the fact that one shot had missed, and instead chose to ignore the evidence of the Zapruder film. In an attempt to maintain their single bullet theory, the commission claimed that Governor Connally had simply suffered a delayed reaction to his wounds. Dr. Robert Shaw was the attending surgeon at Parkland Hospital who operated on the governor.
I would disagree, because I don't think that there would be a delayed action to a wound that was as massive as the wound he received of his chest. And I'm also influenced by what Nellie Connally said. She said that her husband was struck and reared up like a wounded animal before she heard the bullet. Heard the shot that had been fired. So this would indicate that his reaction was almost immediate.
Let me emphasize that there is no conceivable way that a person who is not under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or who is not involved in a kind of a military situation where you have tremendous stress taking over and all kinds of things happening to your endocrine system, there's no way for an individual to sustain 3 holes into, well, actually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 holes into and out of the chest, into and out of the wrist, and into the left thigh, and to have major structures damaged in the fashion that I referred to before and still remain alert. There simply is no way that his face could appear so tranquil as is demonstrated in 230 with not the slightest suggestion of any kind of pain, nothing that has been evoked by all of these bullet wounds, and there's no way that that right wrist could have continued to clutch the large Texas Stetson hat after the nerve had been severed.
In their attempt to somehow explain the governor's reactions, the commission ignored perhaps the most important witness to the events.
But unquestionably, when the first shot was fired, I recognized it as a shot. I thought of nothing else but that it was a rifle shot. I turned to my right. I had time to think. I had time to react. And I turned to my right to look back over my right shoulder to see if I could see anything unusual, and particularly to see if I could catch him out of the corner of my eye. Because I immediately thought...
Him, you mean
the president.
The president.
Because I immediately thought of an assassination attempt. The moment I heard the shot, I didn't see anything except just the general blur of waving of people moving, but nothing really unusual. I did not see the president out of the corner of my eye, and I was in the process of turning back to look over my left shoulder, and had about come to the point where I was looking straight forward again when I felt the impact of the bullet that hit me. I am convinced beyond any question of a doubt that the first shot that was fired did not hit me. Then I was hit.
Despite the insistent testimony of Governor Conley that he was hit by a different shot, the commission clung to their 1-bullet, 2-victim scenario. The critics, however, raised other arguments.
One of the major difficulties the Warren Commission had with the implementation of the single bullet theory as sort of a magic solution to the problems of evidence that they were faced with was the fact that Governor Conley and President Kennedy were not properly aligned for the single bullet to inflict all the non-fatal wounds.
When you study any frame of the Zapruder film prior to the shooting, you will see that Conley was seated essentially directly in front of Kennedy. There is simply no way for a bullet to have emerged from the midline of Kennedy's neck anteriorly, moving downward and to the left to get over to Governor Conley's right posterior axillary area, which means just behind the right armpit.
You know, if they could guide missiles like that bullet would have had they been guided, it would be considered to be one of the wonders of the world today. Do you have any idea how many different directions it had to go to? It never had the same angle. It never had the same direction.
It is an absolute impossibility. Here again, when you say to these people, as I have on numerous occasions, orally in testimony, in my articles, as a member of the Forensic Pathology Panel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, to my colleagues, how do you account for this? They just look at you and say, well, you don't really know what their positions were. They also say that doesn't the Stemmons Freeway sign block our view of them, and we don't know what happened. But then they ignore that which they know, but which they must set aside, and that is that the period of time that elapses behind the Stemmons Freeway sign is 0.9 seconds, or 9/10 of 1 second. So in other words, what they would have you believe is that in less than 1 second, Conley, by some kind of prearranged, meditated move, went to his left, got shot, and came back to his right, and once again resumed the position directly in front of the president. It's nonsense. It is worse than being disingenuous. It is worse than trying simply to bend over, to be fair-minded and objective. It is, on the part of the investigators who know better, a blatant lie designed to mislead.
At the center of this trajectory problem was the conclusion that a bullet had traveled through the president's neck, exiting in the front of his throat. The commission stated that this finding was reached during the autopsy performed on the president's body at the Bethesda Naval Hospital on the night of the assassination. The results of the autopsy were crucial to the single bullet theory. For there to be even the possibility that both men were hit by the same shot, the bullet which hit the president in the back must have exited from the front of his throat, allowing it to then hit Governor Connally. This autopsy finding, however, was challenged on several key points. Many critics argued that while the commission said the bullet had exited from the front of the throat, the doctors who operated on the president in Dallas disagreed. They said that the wound that they saw in the throat was not an exit wound, but an entrance wound.
Well, Dallas is a large city, and there are many gunshot wounds that come into Parkland Memorial Hospital on a regular basis. This is a normal sort of life for a hospital in a big city, and especially Texas, where a lot of people carry guns. And when they looked at President Kennedy and his throat, they immediately concurred that he had been hit by a shot fired from the front.
The Parkland Hospital doctors held a press conference a few moments after the president was officially pronounced dead. At 2 points, Dr. Malcolm Perry said that when in response to questions he was asked, he said specifically that the wound in the front of the president's neck was a wound of entrance. And each time his superior, Dr. Champ Clark, confirmed what Dr. Perry said. Now, the simplest way and the easiest way to make a pretty definitive determination is the size of the bullet hole. It almost invariably is true that on entering, the bullet makes the smaller hole. It makes a much larger hole than exiting. The size of the hole measured by Dr. Perry at the hospital was 3 by 5 millimeters. That's quite small. That's actually smaller than the size of the bullet, the diameter of the bullet itself. The hole in the president's back, according to the measurement made later at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, was almost twice that size. And on this basis alone, you would never expect the wound on the front of the president's neck to be a wound of exit.
The Parkland doctor's observation of an entrance wound in the front of the president's neck not only destroyed the single bullet theory, it also placed a gunman in front of the limousine, most likely on this grassy knoll where in fact many witnesses and police believed that the shots came from. But when the Dallas doctors later testified about the wound before the Warren Commission, they had a mysterious change of opinion.
It's a strange thing, but when the doctors then testified before the Warren Commission, they changed their opinions. They said it wasn't a wound of entrance, but a wound of exit. Now, what would have caused professional men to change their minds? There's several things that came to play. And first, public opinion came to be, where they said that Oswald was firing and it was from behind. But also, the Secret Service and the FBI had visited them, talked to them about their findings and so forth, and they'd shown them the autopsy report. And the autopsy report said that it was a wound of exit. And so they concluded, based upon the autopsy protocol, that they had been mistaken in their original perception of a wound of entrance.
What is indeed ironic is the fact that the Dallas doctors changed their opinions of the wound based upon the autopsy report. Yet the doctors who performed the autopsy never even saw the bullet wound in the front of the president's throat.
They missed the wound in the front of the president's neck. They assumed that it was only a tracheostomy, a surgical incision made into the trachea, the windpipe, in order to facilitate breathing in a person who has sustained massive brain damage, such as happened in Kennedy's case. And they never learned until the next day that this was a tracheostomy superimposed upon a bullet hole. They did not trace out the bullet wounds in Kennedy's back or neck. They did not talk with the doctors, and they did not recognize then that this was a hole. This is incredible when you think about it, because the president died from gunshot wounds, and yet here we have people doing the autopsy who missed one of those wounds.
In fact, the doctors who performed the autopsy were so confused as to the true nature of the president's wounds that their official report identifies the back wound as only presumably of entry and the throat wound as only presumably of exit. Yet it was upon this point that the commission's entire case rested.
The difference between it being of entrance and of exit is as great a difference as there can be. So it's not acceptable to say that it's presumably a wound of entrance, but that's what they did.
Had this case ever gone to court, these pathologists would have been destroyed on cross-examination by a competent defense attorney.
This prompted critics to question not only the autopsy findings, but the competence of the pathologist as well.
The autopsy doctors were not the ones who should have been selected for this, because it was outside their experience. There's a big difference between studying forensic medicine in a short course, as a couple of them had, and having the day-to-day practice of dealing with murders. None of them had the experience of dealing with murders.
Some of America's finest forensic pathologists, medical people who perform autopsies and who have worked for the federal government in the past on critical cases in the Washington, D.C. area, stood by their telephones that evening when the president's body was returned to Washington, D.C., but they were never called. Instead, the individuals in charge of the autopsy selected two administrators, individuals who had rarely performed autopsies, to come in and perform one of the most important autopsies in this century.
I don't hesitate in criticizing, not because criticism of the autopsy puts the lie to the Warren Commission reports. I've seen many ridiculously incompetent, inadequate, woefully incomplete medical legal autopsies over 25 years of consultation in death cases throughout the country. And I must say that in many of the instances it doesn't wind up making much difference because the basics may be there. In this case, however, the lack of competence, the lack of thoroughness, the lack of precision of the autopsy all enable us to demonstrate that the Warren Commission's conclusions are inaccurate. I would say, without exaggerating, that this was one of the worst medical legal autopsies that I've ever seen.
The president got an autopsy that wouldn't have been acceptable for a Bowery bum. But Oswald got an autopsy fitting of a president. There aren't real questions about Oswald's autopsy, and there were nothing but questions about the president's autopsy.
One of the most important and controversial questions concerned the location of the wound in the president's back. This sketch, prepared at the direction of the pathologist, places the wound at the base of the president's neck, a location which was essential to the single bullet theory. For only if the back wound was above the throat wound could the bullet have the necessary downward trajectory to then hit Governor Connally below the right armpit. Substantial evidence, however, completely contradicted this location of the wound, placing it not in the president's neck, but much lower down on his back.
In any investigation of this kind, in any investigation of a homicide, one of the most important pieces of evidence is the death certificate. What the certificate of death signed by the president's own physician says, with no ifs and buts, is that the president was shot at the level of the third thoracic vertebra.
This low position of the wound at the level of the third thoracic vertebra was confirmed by the autopsy body chart. Prepared by the doctors during their examination of the body, this diagram clearly shows that the bullet entered not in the president's neck, but almost 6 inches lower in his back. This location also coincides with the holes which the bullet made in the president's clothes. Photographs of Kennedy's jacket and shirt confirm the fact that the bullet entered nearly 6 inches lower than the commission claimed.
The autopsy doctors lied. when they said that the wound was not in the president's back, but was in his neck where it joins the shoulder. There is no way that they could have made that mistake by accident. You can't possibly make a mistake. The death certificate itself says that it was at the third thoracic vertebra. The body chart they made during the autopsy shows that it's 4 inches lower than they testified to. The holes in the president's clothing shows that is where the body chart says it is. It is where the death certificate says it is. There is no evidence that the bullet was not in the president's back, and there is no way they could have made that mistake innocently.
But the doctors had to mislocate the wound in order to make the commission's lone assassin theory possible.
They moved the bullet hole up several inches to make it fit in with the scenario of Oswald having done the shooting from the 6th floor window. The sketch made on the night of the autopsy showed the bullet hole almost 6 inches down below the level of the top of the shoulder, and yet the bullet emerged from the level of the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple. They didn't know that, however, you see, when they made the diagram, because they never knew that there was a bullet hole in the front of the president's neck. They thought it was just a surgical incision, a tracheostomy. It was that, but the tracheostomy had been made on top of the bullet hole. And now when they learned that the hole in the front of the neck was also a bullet hole, and it was at the level of the knot of the tie, then they couldn't have a hole 6 inches down below the crest of the shoulder and have Oswald doing the shooting from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. So they simply moved it up to the crest of the shoulder.
There was no possibility of anything like this happening if anybody was tried, Lee Harvey Oswald or anybody else. But since they immediately decided without any investigation that Oswald was a lone assassin, once Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, there was nothing to go to trial, and that's when the autopsy revisions began, when the prosector found out that Ruby had killed Oswald.
The death of Lee Harvey Oswald played a key role in the writing of the autopsy report, as Weisberg later found out.
There was nothing about the autopsy that wasn't unusual, including where Dr. Humes wrote it. Understandably, he worked late at night, early in the morning at the Navy Hospital. Instead of going back to his office and working there the next day, he just got everything that he could and went to his, what more appropriate place can you have? His recreation room. And in his recreation room, he wrote out an autopsy report. He just finished writing out, this is his testimony, by the way. He just finished writing his report out when he hears on television that Oswald's been killed. Well, you might ask, what difference does that make to his report? There's only one sense in which he can make a difference. And that is, he knows very well there's not going to be any trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. He's dead. So Dr. Humes said he rewrote the autopsy and burned the original draft.
Dr. Humes' destruction of his original draft, later certified and approved by the president's personal physician, went unchallenged by the Warren Commission. Although we will never know for certain what the original report contained, the evidence appears clear on this point, that once Oswald was dead and there was no possibility of a trial, the autopsy doctors deliberately mislocated the wound in the president's back, a falsification which was essential to the commission's contention that Oswald was the sole assassin. The most important piece of physical evidence in the commission's theory was Commission Exhibit 399, a bullet found on an unidentified stretcher at Parkland Hospital. Ballistically matched to the rifle found in the book depository, Commission Exhibit 399 was the only piece of evidence which could directly tie Oswald to the shooting. Since it could not possibly be the bullet that missed, nor the one which fragmented in the president's head, it was imperative to the commission's case that 399 be the bullet that inflicted all of the non-fatal wounds. The near-perfect condition of Exhibit 399, however, presented a problem.
As of the time that bullet reached the FBI laboratory, Robert Fraser is the ballistics examiner who got it. It was almost perfect. It was slightly flattened at the end that is attached to the shell, the back end of the bullet. It wasn't flattened much, but it was flattened there. Fraser testified to its condition when he received it, when he was a witness before the Warren Commission. And I'm paraphrasing his testimony, but is roughly this, that if that bullet had struck coarse cloth or leather, he would have expected to find microscopic marks on it, and there were no such microscopic marks. Now, I'm not trying to palm myself off as an FBI expert, but I was a soldier. I fired pistols, I fired rifles, I had my own, I fired them. When I was a young man, I used to shoot tin cans, pieces of wood, things like that. I have never seen a bullet hit anything without being marked up, and if it hits anything hard, it's going to be deformed in varying degrees. This bullet doesn't have a scratch on it.
The Commission's own witnesses were among the most dubious. Without exception, all of the Commission's medical experts agreed that bullet 399 could not possibly have caused all of the governor's wounds.
This bullet is too pristine for a bullet that had shattered a rib and also badly shattered the radius, which is a good, strong bone. I am sure that the bullet that inflicted these wounds on Governor Connally was fragmented much more than this bullet shows.
In April 1964, the Commission convened a panel of ballistic experts to perform tests to see if, in fact, it was possible for this bullet to cause so much damage and still remain in perfect condition. In these tests, bullets of the same type as 399 were fired into the chests of goats and through the wrists of human cadavers in order to simulate the governor's wounds. These bullets, however, were considerably deformed.
The bullets that were fired through the goat carcasses, different goats breaking just one rib, all showed significant deformity. The bullets that were fired through the wrist of human cadavers showed much more deformity. They had the typical peeling back, mushrooming effect that you see when bullets impact against dense, firm objects. And yet, Commission Exhibit 399, which according to the Warren Commission is the missile that broke both the rib and the wrist bone of Governor Connally, is, as I have already explained, essentially pristine.
No, it could not have caused all the wounds, because our experiments have showed beyond any doubt that merely shooting the wrist deformed the bullet drastically. And yet this bullet came out as almost a perfectly normal, pristine bullet.
Dr. Joseph Dolce was the chief consultant in wound ballistics for the U.S. Army, who supervised these tests for the Warren Commission.
And so they gave us the original rifle, the Mannlicher Carcano, plus 100 bullets, 6.5 millimeters. And we went and we shot the cadaver wrist, as I've just mentioned, and in every instance, the front or the tip of the bullet was smashed. It's impossible for a bullet to strike a bone, even at low velocity, and still come with a perfectly normal tip. The tip of this bullet was absolutely not deformed in no instance whatsoever, in no amount. Under no circumstances do I feel that this bullet could hit the wrist and still not be deformed. We proved that by experiments.
The undamaged condition of bullet 399 presented the Commission with still another dilemma. While 399 appeared to be completely intact, the bullet which struck Governor Connally left fragments of metal in all 3 of the governor's wounds.
The bullet left identifiable pieces of itself radiologically. That is, you can see them on x-rays in Kennedy's chest, in Connally's chest, Connally's wrist, and Connally's thigh. So we've got 4 anatomic locations in these 2 men where pieces of the bullet, albeit quite small, but visible to the naked eye without any special enhancement photographic techniques, can be seen. There's no way that all those pieces could have come from the bullet, and yet had the bullet lose only 1 to 1.5% of its total weight, which is exactly what it was found to have lost. The bullet, as found, weighed 158.6 grains. In its pristine state, it weighs no more than 161 grains.
The conclusive evidence, which completely destroys the Commission's theory, is the fact that more grains of metal were recovered from Governor Connally's wrist wound alone than could have possibly come from Commission Exhibit 399.
You begin to understand why most of us call this the magic bullet and the magic bullet theory. It's just unbelievable that they could get away with it. almost as unbelievable that they would dare try. Of course, they worked in secrecy, so nobody knew what happened until after the report was out.
My colleagues in forensic pathology, who were members of the panel on which I served, when confronted with this, they say, well, bullets do strange things. That's an exact quote. I'll never forget it till the day I die. Bullets do strange things. I've said to them, well, you guys collectively have done together 150,000 medical legal autopsies, and several thousand, 10, 20 of those, 30, 40 have involved bullet wounds. Why don't you all go back to your files and come up with one case, or why don't you all go out and do an experiment and come in with one bullet that will do what 399 is to have done, is alleged to have done under the single bullet theory, and you'll prove your case. Well, there never was such a case file presented. There never was such an experiment conducted. There never again, and never was in the past, in the history of gunfire and civilization, a bullet that did what this bullet is supposed to have done under the single bullet theory. That is the foundation of the whole report. And once you remove that keystone, then the whole thing collapses.
It was for this reason alone that the commission ultimately accepted 399 as their single bullet. They had no other choice. For while they could ignore the governor's doctors, the ballistics experts, and even their own bullet tests, there was one fact which the commission could not ignore. Without 399, there could be no single bullet theory. And without this theory, there could not be a lone assassin.